Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in Australia you're coming from. Welcome to this NRCoP hybrid event on the public value of regulation and why it matters. I'm Webb, the Chair of the National Regulators Community of Practice, and I'll be your facilitator for today's event. We're coming to you live from the beautiful Nipaluna, and on behalf of myself and everyone on the panel today, I'd like to open the webinar by acknowledging the First Peoples from all our countries and pay my respect to them. We honour their wisdom and stewardship of traditional lands, waters and customs which enrich us all. We're here in Hobart with a room full of engaged and enthusiastic regulators and some beautiful Hobart weather as well. And we also have an audience of over 400 people joining us from across the country. Just before I introduce the speakers for today, a few points about the webinars. All the webinars are recorded and will be available on the ANZSOG YouTube channel. We'll also be preparing short videos of key points that you'll be able to access through our social media platforms. We're using the Q&A function in Zoom for questions, and I encourage you to do this. There'll be a good chunk of time at the end of the presentations for our speakers to answer questions. I just wanted to mention we've been having a little bit of technical difficulty this morning, and the slides showing up on the webinar might be a bit blurry. On the recording, they will come out fine, and hopefully people will be able to see them, but just to let you know ahead of time that they may not be the best quality just on the webinar for now. We'll attempt to get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A session, but if we don't run out of time, we'll ask our speakers to follow up in writing, answering some of the questions, and so we'll add that to the webinar recording, and it will also be available on the website. For people online, if your webinar stream cuts out, please stay with us and the team will be working in the background to get the issue back up as soon as possible. Of course, if your own internet connectivity drops out, just start your internet again and rejoin the seminar, but hopefully we'll have none of that. Okay, so today's session is on the public value of regulation and why it matters. And we're going to explore the public value of regulation, why regulation matters, and why we need to shift the narrative away from regulatory burden and towards the positive value that regulation plays. As you hear from the panel today on their experiences, we've asked them to address and highlight the Tasmanian context and tell us about the crucial role that regulators play in creating public value, minimising harm and protecting the community and the environment. So we've got some great Tasmanian speakers today for the launch of our Tasmanian chapter. Firstly, we'll hear from Professor Gale, who's a professor and head of discipline of politics and international relations in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Tasmania. His research focuses on rethinking the discipline of political economy from sustainability and systems perspectives and working through the implications of this for consumption, production, trade, investment and governance. It's got a long-standing interest in the theory and practice of multi-stakeholder governance, with experience particularly in forestry, fisheries, eggs, organics, fair trade and energy standards and certification and labelling schemes. Then we'll hear from Anne Hamilton, who's a Conservation Program Officer and works with the Private Land Conservation Program at the Department of Natural Resources and Environment in Tasmania. And her role includes the administration of the nature conservation covenants, including preparation of covenant dealings and their registration. So Anne's background is in commercial and property law, and she's interested in the effectiveness and review of regulation and engagement of the public with regulation and its review. And then finally, we'll hear from Peter Boyles, the Chief Pharmacist at the Tasmanian Department of Health. Peter has over 2 decades experience in medicines and poisons regulation, and his regulatory accomplishments include the development and rollout of Australia's first real-time reporting system for prescription medicines, and the development of robust, evidence-informed and clinician-led regulatory quality assurance processes for high-risk and dependence-producing medicines. And he led the development and implementation of Tasmania's controlled access schemes for medical cannabis products. So a good variety of speakers today, and it's my great pleasure to now hand over to them to do their presentations. As we mentioned at the beginning, think of any questions and post them on Zoom during this presentation, so we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards. So Professor Gale, we'll start with you. Thank you.
Super, thank you very much. So I've been given the somewhat difficult task of raising the theoretical issues, and I'm going to try and convince you that public value can be married with sustainability to create something called public sustainability value, which gives public value, in my view, maybe a little bit more content. So is that going to work? Oh. We're bouncing around a bit. There we go. So in overview then, I'll give you a very pen portrait of the political economy of value. I'll talk a little bit about the concept of public value. I'll try and do a bit of integration around sustainability, and then talk a little bit about regulating for sustainability value. If all that seems very esoteric, and I imagine it will, my colleagues are going to bring you down to earth in a very practical way. So in the history of political economy, value has had essentially three meanings. If you go back to Adam Smith and read The Wealth of Nations, you'll see that the early sections of that talk about what is of value in three terms. So a thing can be of value for its use, for the labor that's embodied in it, or for its exchange. And you can think about that in the context of the value of a songbird, for example, or anything that you might think might be valuable. So a songbird can be valuable because it's useful, it can be valued because labor was expended on raising it, or it can be valued for exchange, is kind of how this plays out. Now there's a core value missing, I think, in the classical literature, which is the idea that a thing can be of value for itself. It can be of value for the function it is serving within the ecosystem in which it operates. So we can term that function value, which gives us four fundamental values, which are important for regulators, I think, to bear in mind in any regulation they are developing. The problem we have today then is that economists in particular reduce this complex idea of value down to exchange value. The only thing that economists think about when they think about value is exchange value. And if you look at what GNP means, then that is simply the sum total every quarter of all the exchanges that occur in an economy that take place in monetary means. So everything else does not count. Everything else in our society doesn't count. And if you want a really good introduction to that, Marilyn Waring's work is exceptional. So this brings us to public value, because public value kind of arrives on the scene around the same time that Marilyn Waring is saying we've got to recognize that there's way more value in society than we think. And Moore and Bennington are also wrestling with this issue about the kind of distinction between private value, which is what corporations produce, and public value, they want to say, which is what regulators and the public sector produce. And so they introduce a really interesting debate around this concept of public value. And the core feature of their approach is the strategic triangle, which many of you may be familiar with, where public value is achieved by regulators in two ways. They network with a whole range of internal and external stakeholders to develop the legitimacy that's required to deliver this value. And they also muster the resources, both tangible and intangible, to actually make it happen. And so that's kind of the value that regulation is bringing to the public, and it's resulting in public value. But there is a tension here. What is public value? And there's kind of two answers, I would say, in the literature on public value. One is the simple answer, what the public want. And the other one is what the public need. Now, those are very much in tension with each other, because what the public wants can lead to populism, and arguably regulators shouldn't be responding to that. But what the public needs can lead to paternalism, and that has its own dangers too. So can we give public value a little bit more oomph and content? I think we can, because I think what's missing here is the new idea of sustainability. So you'll hopefully be somewhat familiar with a little bit of the potted history of sustainability, but it really gets going in public terms in 1987 with the publication of the Brundtland Commission report. And then there's a whole series of UN conferences leading us up to the Sustainable Development Goals, which were negotiated at the end of 2015, and we're all supposed to be doing them now. So one of the things you can ask yourself is to what extent you're actually doing them now in your daily work, because we've all signed on to this around the world. And yet I think it's still remaining something of it's a shadow of what it should be. Now, the interesting thing about sustainability is that it's a core challenge to the idea that only economic value matters, because we're going to have to achieve all sorts of values here. We're going to have to recognize function value that are involved in the biosphere, a number of use values and social values at the level of society, and then finally on top of that, we've got the residual economic value. So if we do that, then we're moving into a different understanding of the role of the public sector. So the role of the public sector has changed in the post-war period. If you were a public sector official in the post-war period from about 1945 to 1979, your role was to safeguard jobs and ensure full employment along with a good economy. And a lot of the levers that public officials were pulling were fiscal levers and taxation levers in order to achieve that relative balance. In the revolution that occurred in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher arrived in the White House and Ronald Reagan the year later in the United States was to introduce the new public sector management where exchange value becomes king. It's all about exchange value. Government's part of the problem, not part of the solution. We've got to get government out of the way so that we can release the corporations to work their magic and generate vast quantities of wealth. Well, after 40, 50 years of that, we're starting to see a lot of the negative consequences of that happening, both on the social side with unbelievable inequality, both within and across countries, and an ongoing environmental disaster that shows no sign of being solved. So in the new era of what I'm going to call public sector management for sustainability, it's going to be the role of all regulators, I think, to fully engage with sustainability and to embrace the four value problem, which is how do we integrate exchange value with use value, with labor value, and with function value to achieve the sustainable development goals and sustainability going forward. So I think there are enormous implications here then for the role of regulators, for the way in which we can conceptualize the strategic triangle, because it then means your role is even more to encourage an authorizing environment in which decent policy can be passed, as well as even more muster the relevant organizational resources to deliver. So I think it further raises the importance of regulators to regulate in the right way, not just to regulate for regulation's sake. So I think this is really interesting from the point of view of where you're at and where you might be going. I would add a codicil here that it also, I think, has enormous ramifications for politics, but I'll leave that as a teaser in case there's questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fred. We'll now turn to Anne for a presentation about the nature conservation covenants, and Anne will talk to a few case studies as well as explain the covenants to us.
Thank you, Rose. Regulation relating to the conservation of private land is a really good example of the positive contribution that regulation can make. I'll quickly outline what nature conservation covenants are, then turn to some case studies, and then by briefly outlining the enforcement provisions and some of the challenges facing conservation covenants. So regulation relating to the conservation of private land is state-based regulation. Examples include the Biodiversity Conservation Act of New South Wales and the Native Vegetation Act of South Australia. There are also examples in Canada and New Zealand. In Tasmania, the primary legislation is the Nature Conservation Act of 2002, but importantly, it acts in partnership with the Land Titles Act and the Conveyancing and Law of Property Act. Nature conservation covenants are formal, written, perpetual agreements between the Crown and the landowner relating to the protection of natural values on private land. They're registered on the title records, and a copy of the scanned dealing can be obtained by searching the Land Titles Register. The importance of the regulation can be highlighted by comparing restrictive covenants with nature conservation covenants. Restrictive covenants are creatures of equity and of 19th century English case law. They're often created when land is subdivided or sold to protect the amenity of the surrounding land. They bind successive owners of the land, and they can only be enforced by landowners who benefit from the covenant. Nature conservation covenants are creatures of statute, and they are able to do what they do because of the interaction of Part 5 of the Nature Conservation Act with Section 102 of the Land Titles Act and Section 90AB of the Conveyancing and Law of Property Act. Because of that interaction, nature conservation covenants run with the land to bind successive owners of the land, even though they were not party to the original agreement with the Crown. The Crown can enforce nature conservation covenants, even though the Crown does not own land that will benefit from the covenant. And thirdly, nature conservation covenants can be both negative and positive. Restrictive covenants can only be negative. They're not enforceable to the extent that they impose positive obligations on landowners. So nature conservation covenant dealings contain some positive obligations, including a general obligation on the landowner to preserve and enhance the land subject to covenant. This slide shows you how nature conservation covenants have spread across Tasmania. We now have 954, protecting about 115,000 hectares of Tasmania's natural environment. Last year we registered 15, and I hope we'll come close to that this year. These case studies are of three particular attributes of nature conservation covenants. We have several covenants on King Island. Much of the native vegetation on King Island has been cleared. There's only about 30% of the vegetation cover on King Island that is native vegetation, and about 20% of that is private land. Native vegetation cover is essential habitat for flora and fauna. And on King Island, that includes 2 species of birds endemic to King Island, both of which are endangered. An important aspect of privately protected land is that it contributes to the reserve estate. And so it can add not only just additional hectares, but also increase the connectedness of reserve land. This large covenant at Red Hut Road on the south of King Island is on the east coast of the southern tip of the island, and it joins a large conservation area, and that joins a state reserve. So there is a continuous stretch of reserve land from the west to the east coast of King Island. The covenant at the Campbelltown Golf Course is an interesting example of how important the management by landowners is. This covenant protects a threatened native vegetation community, a grassland community, and that vegetation community includes some flowering plants, including some endangered orchids. The The orchids and the flowering plants have been able to survive in the roughs of the golf course because the roughs of the golf course are only slashed occasionally at times when the flowering plants are not vulnerable. By contrast, the greens and fairways of the golf course have been fertilised, sown with non-native grasses and are regularly mown. The populations of the endangered orchids at the Campbelltown, in the roughs of the Campbelltown golf course, are important primary populations for these plants. And in some cases, the records are the highest numbers recorded in the state. The Covenant at Crago Hill, which is northeast of Hobart, is an example of how nature conservation covenants protect not only threatened native vegetation communities, but also the fauna that depends on them. Eucalyptus globulus dry forest and woodland, which is blue gum, is a threatened native vegetation community. The east and southeast of Tasmania is a stronghold. Mature blue gum trees develop hollows, which are important nesting habitat, and including for the critically endangered swift parrot. Swift parrots leave the mainland in August and September to travel to Tasmania, where they nest and breed over the summer. And then they leave Tasmania in April, May to return to the mainland for winter. The flowering blue gum is an important food source for the swift parrot. The department has a swift parrot recovery project, and as part of that project, we have registered some covenants recently, and we're working on others. The Nature Conservation Act contains some enforcement provisions. Section 46(1) provides that the Crown, that is a criminal offence for someone against whom the Crown can enforce the covenant to breach the terms of the covenant. Subsection 2 of that section provides that the Crown can take civil proceedings against a person convicted of that offence to recover the Crown's costs, to recover any financial incentive for entering into the covenant, and also to recover any financial gain the landowner has made by breaching the covenant. There are both opportunities and challenges for conservation covenants. Climate change is already having an impact on some of our threatened native vegetation communities, and it is also increasing the risk of fire. Our stewardship officers are spending increasing amounts of time working with stakeholders to provide authorisations and plans for managed burns to reduce the impact on the natural values of fire. The nature conservation covenants are agreements between the landowner and the Crown, so they're only enforceable against the landowner. The problem that is difficult for us to manage is the impact of trespassers onto covenanted land, who enter onto covenanted land, cut wood, make tracks, ride trail bikes, all of which have a negative impact on the natural values. Changing land use is also a challenge. The introduction of technology or infrastructure such as irrigation systems can change the use for which land can be used. Managing land subject to covenant can also be expensive for landowners, particularly if it involves weed control or fencing. I hope there will be opportunities for landowners in the carbon credit market and also perhaps in the biodiversity trading scheme that will come through the recent Nature Repair Act. I hope I've given you a quick overview. There's a lot more I could say, but the Nature Conservation Act and its partners really make a really valuable contribution to our environment.
Thanks, Sam, for that great example of regulators adding public value. And we'll now turn to Peter for his presentation.
Thank you. So in Tasmania, in the late 90s, early 2000s, we were seeing a very large number of Tasmanians that were dying from prescription opioid poisoning. When I say prescription opioid, I mean supplied through the medical system. And many people in the room and online will be aware of the opioid crisis as it's described in the US, where there are hundreds of thousands of deaths associated with these prescription opioids. So at that time, Tasmania was seeing more prescription opioid deaths than road traffic deaths, by way of example. Actually, I should have checked this morning, but Hobart's local paper used to put road traffic deaths year to date inside the front cover. Opioid deaths have never had that level of profile, that's for sure. Those deaths were partly through unsafe use of those drugs. So some of that's through diverted into the illicit scene. We don't have a lot of heroin in Tasmania compared to sort of the bigger cities of Australia like Melbourne and Sydney, Brisbane. But we have the same rate of injecting drug use. So there was some deliberate intentional use of those medicines, not as prescribed. But there was also just basically poor care and a poor understanding of the risks associated with opioids and their relative low efficacy. So what did we do as regulators? The Tasmania's Poisons Act creates a head of power that requires a medical practitioner or any prescriber to seek authority from the Secretary to prescribe those medicines. That power is delegated down to my colleagues in our Pharmaceutical Services branch of the Department of Health. And in assessing those applications, we apply a risk assessment to the danger to the patient and the public, and make decisions on whether or not there is a positive risk-benefit assessment. We do that with the support of our lead clinicians in addiction, pain, and general practice. And with their support, we develop what we call a clinical regulatory service. I wouldn't say it's unique in Australia or internationally, but we've certainly developed a system that is much more robust than anything I've seen described anywhere else. So that's sort of what we've done. What I wanted to talk about is sort of the regulatory craft about how we did that. So we're aware there was a problem, but nobody else really saw that there was a problem yet. So we actually had to create that burning platform. And there was something Fred touched on before, and we had a brief discussion just before the session started when we were talking about networking. And I'll get to that in my next slide. We actually, in creating the problem and selling the problem, we listened to our stakeholders, we built stakeholder champions, but we also advocated to those stakeholders. So sometimes as regulators, I think we're probably all familiar with the concept that we have to regulate within the environment that we find ourselves in. And if we as regulators are seen to be too far away from what the accepted norm is, we come to grief. My challenge to the room and to those online is, as a regulator, not to accept that environment as a static thing, but to say you can advocate to move that environment and make people, your stakeholders, understand that what the status quo is not acceptable. And we don't just do that by regulating hard, we actually have to change minds in that space. So this is probably the biggest point I wanted to get across today, and what I'm saying is that as advocators, as regulators, have the courage of convictions and be prepared to advocate. So in developing our clinical regulatory service, building stakeholder champions and moving what was accepted as good practice and understood to be good practice within Tasmania, we improved adherence to the evidence-based guidelines and basically standards of care. So that's great, but what does that actually mean? It's a nice thing for me to say. In the early 2000s, for every 100 patients that were prescribed an opioid, so when I say opioid, just to be clear, that's morphine and the type of drugs like that. So they are, many of us have had surgery, will have been exposed to an opioid post-surgically. Those of us that have got loved ones or ourselves who've had cancer and pain associated with cancer, opioids are used in that. We were told in the late 90s by some thought leaders, and there's a whole presentation you could do on that space, that opioids were safe and effective for persistent non-cancer pain. Flash forward a couple of decades, and it's fair to say that those claims were overstated, shall we say. So for every 100 people in Tasmania that was prescribed an opioid, we saw a death, a poisoning death. Let that sink in for a while, because if anybody wants to tell me any other medical intervention that we'd accept, one death per 100 people treated, I'd like to know about it. Good news is we've made a huge difference. It's now only about 1 in 500. but there's 10,000 Tasmanians getting opioids prescribed. So this is a huge success story as far as we're concerned. How we did it was not just by saying, well, there's some guidelines out there and we're going to regulate and hold people accountable to the guidelines. What we did was made sure, and it's particularly something you can do in Tasmania, but made sure that the key players in Tasmania were on board and champions of what we were doing and supporting us. So we cultivated those champions. We also told people what we were going to do. Then we did what we said we were going to do. And then we told them that we did what we said we were going to do. Seems a funny thing to say, but it builds credibility. And the last point I wanted to make is that we did that, but it's not at a point in time and we say, right, this is the way we're going to be approaching this problem moving forward. We are constantly reassessing what the problem is, reassessing who our stakeholders we need to be engaged with, reassessing where the environment we're operating is and where it needs to be, and constantly adapting what we're doing to the environment that we're currently in, and also looking forward to say, where's it heading? Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to all our panel for some great presentations. We do have a few questions online, and I might start with a tough one. So, Fred, you're going to get this one. It's about, and I think we've heard from Anne and Peter about some great examples of creating public value, but where do regulators have problems creating public value? What sort of things do regulators do that maybe work against creating public value?
I don't think our political economy is particularly well set up at the moment to create public value. So a lot of regulation that's going on is remediating problems that are being generated outside of the public sector. Now, there's a very interesting report by the Special Rapporteur to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations by David Boyd, produced a couple of weeks ago, I think. And I'd advocate everyone reading that because it is an indictment of it's an indictment of large corporations. And our political economy over the last 50 years has allowed corporations to run riot. And we're starting to see all of the negative consequences of that. This isn't an attack on business per se. We all recognize that many businesses do the right thing. But we also must recognize that there are huge, mega powerful corporations in the world that are in a sense busily working against the whole ethos of public value because they are misguided about what value is. It's not that they're evil, nasty people. They're misguided about what value is because they do believe the Smithian insight that if you only focus on exchange value, all other good values will follow. That's essentially what we've been living in the maybe not quite so Anthropocene anymore, if you've been following the geological debate on that. I think regulators are in a bit of a tough bind at the moment because they don't get the support from the system that they need. And a fair amount of regulation is remediating the damage that the system is permitting. So think of the current issues that we're confronting at the moment. Think of, the various inquiries into Coles and Woolies and price gouging of consumers. Think of Qantas and the airline industry and the problems that we're confronting there. Look across Tasmania, look at the housing situation, look at the enormous cost of living crisis that people are confronting. These are all problems of the way we run our current political economy. And if we're serious about sustainability, which is my passion, if we're serious about sustainability, then the consequences are massive for both regulators, and I would say, yes, absolutely, advocate away, because, you know, I think that that is going to be an important role for regulators in the future. You're going to have to be advocates for sustainability, because, you know, quite simply, we can't go on doing what we've been doing. We need to bring this value. We need to bring exchange value. We need to drag it back into use value and labor value and social value. And then we end up with a complex hybrid, which requires all of those negotiation skills across the diverse stakeholders to produce something that is genuinely legitimate for society. Sorry, I babbled on.
No, that's okay. Thanks. Great. This is a challenge for us all. And a question for you. You talked a bit about the value that for the Tasmanian environment that the conservation covenants create. Is there a sort of broader value internationally, nationally, that you could sort of see comes from that use of that regulatory tool that you have?
Well, I think the important thing about conservation covenants is it's a commitment by a private individual to natural values. And you might have heard of the 2030 World Leaders Pledge to reverse biodiversity by 2030. A recent review of the Biodiversity Conservation Act in New South Wales referred to the huge task. We can't leave it to governments. It does involve the community. And I think that's the really important thing. That if you have the neighbour down the road's got a sign on their block that says it's privately protected land, I think there's just a huge influence by that governments can't achieve. That's what I think privately conserved land can do.
Great, thank you. Peter, we've got a question here about the use of the media. You mentioned that you weren't being reported on the second page of the paper every day, but did you use the media in any way to sort of support your regulatory activity, or even to tell the story after it had happened?
Certainly not public media. We've done some work within sort of medical and pharmacy media circles. Not very much, and that's, I didn't talk to it, but in my slide I talked about the challenge of being a regulator is if you're looking for universal acclaim and support, you're not going to get it. And I've got to say, many of the Tasmanians that are alive because of the work we've done hate our guts. So it's a difficult space to be in. It's a difficult space to sell what we've been doing. So the answer is probably no.
Yeah. Might just follow on with a question about, and I think you're not alone in a regulator not being well liked by parts of the environment. In fact, I always say if people on both sides don't think you're doing a great job, you're probably steering right down the middle and doing the right thing. Yeah. But it's always challenging to manage a team who's working in that environment, and it'd be just interesting to hear how you sort of made sure that the team came along with you and held their nerve in taking on sort of pushing the boundaries like you were.
Yeah, and it's an omnipresent issue for our team because they're having difficult conversations. They're frequently engaging, particularly with general practitioners, feeding back that there is significant risk that's been identified, and that's leading to the GPs having to have difficult conversations with their patients. They're not very happy to hear that because they're about to have their day ruined. And so we've actually got some formal but also probably informal processes around making sure that people are checking in frequently to see if they're okay. We do have a euphemistically called crying room for people. So there's very much a culture of an immediate debrief because unfortunately, nearly all of us now work in the open plan offices. So people aren't sitting in their own private space having this potentially quite stressful interaction. They're doing it with their peers with them. So we've very much fostered a culture of checking in and having an immediate debrief and are you okay, and maybe even making a joke about it. So that's how we deal with that. But it's a real issue. Yeah.
Yeah. And one issue for the regulatory tool that you're using is you've got to bring private landowners along with you, and in some ways it's a cost to them. You're going back to Fred's discussion about people thinking of value as money only. How do you get people to agree to enter into a covenant?
We actually have a waiting list of people who want to,
okay.
And I think perhaps it's a feature of Tasmania's environment. And I hope we will be able to make some progress on that waiting list. So I think it's over the last few years, there's been more emphasis on biodiversity loss, on the importance of the natural environment. I think the community is starting to catch up with that. The stewardship officers, they delight in telling me the messages they get from when they go out on stewardship visits and the appreciation expressed by the landowners. So it's actually, I think there's been a change. Well, certainly since I was 20 years old, there's a change in the way that Tasmanians value their natural environment.
So being able to engage people to come along with you to help create the public value from the measure. Yeah, that's really great. A question for you, Fred. Would you say the role of the regulator is more about creating awareness and concern for the environment, and on creating behaviour and actions, rather than just ensuring that people are complying with the exact letter of the law? And so what would your sort of advice be on, how regulators can operate if their role is that wider one about creating public value, regardless of perhaps the legislation that they're stuck with administering?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question for regulators, and there is quite a large critique of the literature on public value for creating mini politicians in a sense. What is the role of the regulator conventionally in the traditional view of public sector management? It is to be across the legislation, to be across the policy, to be across the regulation, and then to interpret that appropriately and let people know what is permissible and what isn't. And the danger, of course, with public value that was pointed out by some Australian colleagues is that it seems to imply that the regulator is responsible for generating this thing called public value, rather than simply enforce the regulations. But I would say, it's now unambiguous. It is now unambiguous that we are in a sustainability crisis, and we're in a sustainability crisis. Well, why are we in a sustainability crisis? There's a lot of answers to that, and one of them actually has to do with the way our minds are programmed. As moderns, I would say. So we all go around with modern minds. I know that's going to sound a little odd, and look at the world through modern eyes. Now, one of the key features of modernity is reductionism. If you confront a problem, you reduce it down to a particularly manageable aspect, and then you tackle that aspect. And so a lot of the time we're running around putting out fires. We're tackling this problem, and going back to the opioid crisis, so we have the Sackler family in the United States developing and then overprescribing OxyContin to anyone who wanted it, generating the opioid crisis that then regulators have to come along and sort out. So, if you're a regulator, then you need to be, I think, aware of the context within which you are regulating. That would be the first thing, the broader political context within you. Obviously, you're going to be constrained, no doubt about it. We don't want our regulators running riot. But, as was suggested, within that envelope, you can reach out to non-conventional stakeholders. You can bring environmental groups into the tent rather than just industry. You can bring social groups into the tent rather than just industry. And you can seek to get a much richer understanding of what good regulation would be if you're actually involved in developing the regulation, or what sensible enforcement would be if you're involved in the enforcement side.
Thank you. I think the next question I can ask of both Anne and Peter, and it's about the skills that you think you need in teams that are working in these sort of ways which are maybe a little bit unconventional or pushing the envelope or thinking about public value more broadly. Might start with you, Peter, just about what sort of skills you think people need to be able to work in that way.
I think they need to have an agility of mind. I think the people, if I think back through our teams, there has been some people that have struggled, and they're the people that want to apply a formula to an approach and not be able to accept the complexity of life. And when you're talking about healthcare, it's complex. So there are some times when things become really apparent that we're in a high-risk situation. Other times you need to take your judgment, you need to listen to other people. So that's probably what I would get to. You need to be flexible, not uninterested. So inquiring minds and learning, because healthcare doesn't stand still. What was considered safe 5 years ago may not be considered safe today or tomorrow.
Yeah. And Anne, what sort of skills in negotiating covenants?
I think it's actually personal communication skills. I come back to our two stewardship officers, who are two passionate, young, good communicators, and their job is to go out to the covenant landowners, make sure they understand the covenant dealings, look at the property and share their passion for the environment with the landowners. And I think if we're going to address the sustainability issues that Fred talks about, we have to bring the community with us, because legislation belongs to everybody. It's not just governments. I think that's probably it's the people skills. I think.
Great, thank you both for that. Peter, I think in your slides you had one of your lessons learned was telling people what you did. How did you do that? Like, what was the way in which you engaged to do that?
We did do some published work, not academic standard, but published in some medical journals. And essentially we cultivated and continued to maintain really strong relationships with our stakeholders. So we're having an ongoing discussion with them, and they were understanding what we were doing and why we were doing it. And I did touch on that before. Part of us being able to build and then maintain a fit-for-purpose regulatory approach is to be in constant engagement with the stakeholders. So we're getting that feedback.
And what about your colleagues in other jurisdictions? Are they facing the same issues that you were, and have you been able to sort of engage with them about how you've gone about this task? So
there's been, and I didn't touch on it today, but one of the things we did was we built Australia's first real-time prescription monitoring system. There's been a lot of work occurring nationally for that to become a national system. So there's a new system that we're in the process of adopting. And I think that is going to bring the regulatory approaches in the other jurisdictions more closely aligned, because at the moment, and I think Fred was talking about it, we're operating, or no, it was Dale, operating in isolation. So we are continuing to benefit from approaches from other jurisdictions, but it has been a slow process. Yeah.
And do other states and territories in Australia have similar arrangements?
Yeah.
And do you liaise with them about how that operates?
I've been able to make connections with some of the other probably legal officers who are involved in conservation programs, and we're all facing the same problems. It's actually a really it's a big source of strength to know that there are other people out there who've got the same issues with their legislation and the need to review it.
Okay, I think I'm going to ask this next tough one of Fred again. Sorry, Fred, you're getting all the tough questions. It's about what we can do if our political masters are telling us to reduce red tape, even if the red tape contributes to public value?
Well, I'm not a regulator, so I'm not sure what you should be telling your senior politicians. But I do think it's I mean, the resources available to put into criticizing public regulation are enormous.
Yeah.
And I don't mean just the physical, the monetary resources to resist it. I mean the kind of marketing resources, or the resources that can be put into marketing to talk about red tape or green tape, or all the kind of negative understandings of what regulation is doing. Now, that's hardly surprising in a sense in the political economy we live in, but it does create a dynamic where the vast majority of people often view regulation as a bad thing, or at least something that's suspect, and one has to have a very good reason. And yet, if you got people around a room and actually talk to them about regulation, they would immediately realize that they need regulation, they want regulation, and otherwise, the world would be very chaotic indeed. So one contemporary example, perhaps, at the state level would be Haiti. It's falling apart. There is no law and order. Law and order is a central sort of regulatory apparatus to ensure that we all follow the rules that make us all able to live reasonable lives. So so there's this weird discourse, I think, out there that doesn't validate regulators. I think it can be tough then it can be tough if you've got a piece of legislation which isn't very good, that is resulting in policies that aren't very good, that are leading to regulations that you think are wrong. I live in a university, I see this every day. And so, I think going back to the point that was made, I think, at that point, you need to explore the envelope within which you're operating to make sure that you're not rule following and that you are trying to deal with the situation within the context, and being very mindful of the consequences of your actions for the individuals that are going to be at the end of it. So I guess that's where I would end up.
I think probably many people have had the experience of simultaneously having politicians tell you to reduce red tape while they are introducing into Parliament pages and pages of new regulations. So I think we're often dealing in that situation. Peter, did you have any surprises with your engagement with stakeholders, either particularly oppositional ones or particularly supportive ones, or did you find you were able to get people to see the perspective of why the regulation and the way you were going to approach it was necessary?
I think I'd probably reflect on that in saying that success isn't all of your stakeholders saying that's great, and that there will always be people who are outliers and will be just against anything that you want to do. Some of your skill and ability to reflect is to not dismiss people as outliers reflexively, but to understand, are they speaking closer to the sort of the mean or the average, or are they genuinely a long way away from what accepted practice should be or what they're advocating for? And that's partly is engaging all the other stakeholders well and reflecting back and feeding into those stakeholders that might be more receptive to say, some of our feedback is this, what do you think about that?
Yeah. And I think that idea that Fred mentioned about broadening your stakeholder community as widely as you can really help out with that as well. Okay, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time for questions. I'd just like to thank again the speakers for the great presentations, but also for the great answers to the questions that we got from our online participants. And thank you everyone who sent in questions. If you're a regular attendee at an ANZSOG webinar, you'll know you'll shortly get a short evaluation survey, and we really appreciate people taking the time to fill that in. That feedback is really helpful for us in planning future events and making sure they address the issues that people want to deal with. I'd just also like to do a quick ad for the Professional Regulator Professional Development Program. Many of you will already know about this program that has been built by the members of the Regulators Community of Practice in collaboration with ANU RegNet. And if you're keen to find out more about that program, have a look on our website for more details. Our next event will be an online event. It will be a focus on the safety and wellbeing of frontline regulatory officers in the field. So people who are really putting the test of exerting public value right on the line. There'll be more information available about that soon. Ask you all to keep an eye out for our socials, LinkedIn and Twitter, and also our emails. And just thank again everyone for joining us today in the room here in Hobart and everyone online. It's been a really fantastic session, and the panelists really appreciate all the contribution that you've made. Thank you.